We're going to try to get started. Hopefully the rest will join us shortly. We are running probably about 45 minutes today. So the next session, that Thomas Jefferson Quran has started from 3 to 3:30 is going to be cancelled because Sister Alexandra Brandon unfortunately called with cancellation late last night. So we're going to get back on track, inshallah. So what we're going to do, we're going to go through this session right now, which is really a very powerful topic. It's about Islamic thought in the making of America and the world, Muslims with Christians and Jews, governance and coexistence. This is comparing Medina's constitution with the U.S. Bill of Rights. So I want to introduce our panelists first. This is a topic that is dear to us at the museum. And it really actually started with a lot of work that we've done with Dr. John Morrow. About 4 years ago, Professor Morrow actually came to visit the museum and had a discussion about the subject of the covenants of Prophet Muhammad with the Christians of the world. This presentation had an impact on us, that we felt the pluralistic nature of Islam since its inception is a story that has to be told. The relationship between Muslims, Christians, and Jews it is a critical story, particularly at this time of our development in this country. So we basically started talking to Dr. Morrow about what do we need to do to get this turned into the book and the research that he worked on for over 15 years. To actually turn it into an exhibition. We've been working to do this since that time, and God willing, we will be opening this new exhibit in Jackson sometime over the next 4 months. So I want to speak a bit about Dr. Morrow. We got to know him extremely well over the last 4 years. We are appreciative of all of his research and the scholarly work that he's done. But he is originally an Aboriginal from Canada. So he is a proud member of the Métis Nation. So he's one of actually the original inhabitants of North America. So this is actually a true honor to have him here with us. So Professor Morrow became a Muslim, really actually I think I can call this a story that he was reading the story of Malcolm X while he was driving and traveling with his parents somewhere. He was touched and impacted by that story. And I think he became a Muslim when he was 16 years old. Since that time, he had published hundreds of academic articles and over 30 scholarly books. But the one that we're going to be focusing on today, which is basically the covenants of the Prophet Muhammad with the Christians of the world, which actually is going to be the subject of this discussion. So with also, with us today, we have the scholarly discussions, but we also have 2 judges. One is a local judge. We're honored to have Judge Denise Owen. Many of you who are from Jackson know Judge Owens extremely well. But she is a chancellor in Hines County and has been actually a strong supporter of the museum since almost the inception of the museum. So we appreciate you and Bob for your diligent support for the museum and the work that the museum has been doing. But also, in addition to this, we have Judge David Shaheed from Annapolis, Maryland, right? Indianapolis. Okay, from Indiana. Okay. I thought I misread you.
Close.
No, I'm not close. Close.
That's geographic.
So we are honored to also have him with us. So both judges actually are going to try to address the presentation that Dr. Morrow is going to start with. He's going to have a 12-minute presentation about the covenants and its impact on the Constitution of Medina and basically the main topic. And we would like for the judges to actually address the United States Constitution and the Bill of Rights and how it actually contrasts with the covenants and the Constitution of Medina. Dr. Morrow.
scholars since the early days of Islam, the constitution of Medina and the covenants of the Prophet were neglected by some jurists and political authorities over the course of Muslim history. Despite the fact that they played a central role in the domestic and foreign policy of the Ottoman Empire, they have been generally overlooked since its collapse in 1923 and the abolition of the Caliphate in 1924. In fact, it was Muhammad Hamidullah who was largely responsible for bringing the Constitution of Medina into life. I refer to the first written constitution in the world, published in 1941, 1975, and 1986, which finally placed the Constitution of Medina center stage. Not only did Muhammad Hamidullah remind Muslims that they actually had a constitution, he was the first scholar to compile and study the letters, treaties, and covenants of the Prophet. The letters and treaties of the Prophet Muhammad, however, did not become widely known until the publication of the covenants of the Prophet Muhammad with the Christians of the world in 2013. A work that has sparked a flurry, or rather a storm of debate, discussion, and dialogue. As a result of the Marrakesh Declaration, the Covenants Initiative, the Constitution of Medina and the Covenants of the Prophet are now the subject of serious discussion among Muslims and non-Muslims who seek scriptural sources to support coexistence, tolerance, civil society, religious rights, the rule of law, love, and goodwill to all. With the end of Islam as a world power, most Muslims look towards the West in search of civil and human rights, neglecting their own rich spiritual and legal tradition. Through a comparison of the Constitution of Medina, the Covenants of the Prophet, and the U.S. Bill of Rights, it will become self-evident that the Islamic tradition is not only entirely compatible with civil and human rights as understood in the Western world, it actually conceived of such rights and granted them as early as the 7th century. In the Western world, we trace the rule of law back to the ancient Greeks. Plato, for example, promoted the notion of benevolent monarchy. Aristotle preached that all citizens should be governed according to the same principles. The next major milestone in the Western world was the Magna Carta, or Great Charter, which dates to 13th century England, which provided a long list of rights and freedoms, including freedom for the Church of England, individual liberty, right to due process, and protections against despotism. The next major development in Western law came as a result of the Declaration of Independence, the American Constitution, and the Bill of Rights. These in turn would inspire constitutions and charters of rights and freedoms in much of the Western world. All of this eventually culminated in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was proclaimed in 1948. One major central piece of the puzzle, however, is missing: the Constitution of Medina, and along with it, the covenants of the Prophet Muhammad. Ignorance, willful or otherwise, has consequences. Lack of knowledge regarding these foundational Muslim documents leads people from all sides of the political spectrum, from leftists and liberals to rightists and conservatives, from agnostics to religious fundamentalists, and from multiculturalists to white nationalists and fascists, to claim that Islam in general, and the Sharia in particular, is incompatible with Western social and political values. How do we respond to ignorance? By replacing it with knowledge. Knowledge of the Constitution of Medina and the covenants of the Prophet. What are the major principles established by the Constitution of Medina, created by the Prophet Muhammad in the early 7th century? To commence with, it clearly states that it is a constitutional document. It establishes the following: citizenship and nationality, a distinctive identity, obligation of the ruler and the ruled, the creation of a court of appeals, equality, pluralism, religious, cultural, and linguistic freedom, equal rights for Muslims and non-Muslims, political rights, freedom of expression, freedom of association, fair and equitable taxation, social insurance for the needy, the end of tribalism and blood feuds, the rule of law and justice for all, the right to live, the prohibition of murder, the obligation of respecting and implementing the law, prohibition of favoritism and nepotism, the centralization of authority, the creation of a system of justice that depended on the community and not the individual, a guarantee of peace and security based on equality and justice, Islam as a code of life, legal accountability, the leader as commander-in-chief of military forces, collective resistance against injustice, tyranny, and mischief, the support of military allies, proportionate liability in bearing war expenses, compulsory mutual help in case of war, prohibition of supporting collective enemies, the right to be a conscientious objector and to not engage in war, mutual consultation and honorable dealing, the prohibition of treachery, the obligation to help the oppressed, the protection of women, the obligation to respect peace treaties, the right to self-defense and fighting for survival of one's way of life, equal constitutional status, the prohibition of violating the Constitution, the prohibition of protecting traitors and oppressors, the favor of God is subject to the observance of the Constitution, which shall be enforced by the state. All of this, and so much more, was concluded and implemented in Arabia in the 7th century. And that is just scratching the surface. The Constitution of Medina is short and concise. It provides the framework of a political system. It cannot and should not be read without consulting the covenants of the Prophet, the charters of rights and freedom that he provided to Jews, Samaritans, Christians, and Zoroastrians. There are some skeptics who hold that they are forgeries. If so, they are forgeries that date back to the 7th century, since these documents have been consecutively transmitted for 1,400 years. So whoever authored the covenants of the Prophet was 1,000 years ahead of his time. If so, from where did he derive his principles? What is the precedent? The only place we find the foundational principles of the Constitution of Medina and the covenants of the Prophet is in the Quran and the Sunnah of Muhammad, the Messenger of God. So for all intents and purposes, the Constitution of Medina and the covenants of the Prophet are authentic in content. The covenants of the Prophet provide a long and detailed list of rights comparable to those found in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So how does this compare to the Magna Carta, the Declaration of Independence, the Bill of Rights, and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights? Is this inconsistent with Western principles of law and justice? I think not. What we have is common ground. The Constitution of Medina and the covenants of the Prophet provided for political representation. The Muslim state was divided into autonomous religious communities, Muslims, Jews, Samaritans, Christians, and so forth. The leader of each community, either tribal or religious, consulted with his flock and conveyed their consensus to the head of state. Although there were no elections per se, there was popular participation, debate, discussion, and dialogue on political issues. The Constitution of Medina and the covenants of the Prophet were developed in consultation with constituents. The Prophet, as the unanimously acclaimed leader, received yearly pledges of allegiance from the people he ruled upon. Freedom of speech and assembly were permitted. Citizens had the right to file complaints. If no settlement could be reached by tribal and religious leaders, the head of state, as impartial mediator of the community as a whole, had the final say. The Constitution of Medina and the covenants of the Prophet all take the right to keep and bear arms for granted. In fact, they insist upon the fact that any weapons borrowed from citizens to help the war effort would be returned. In cases where this was not possible, their value would be reimbursed. Unlike the Bill of Rights, which was responding to excesses of the British Army in quartering soldiers in homes, the covenants of the Prophet require the allies of the Muslims, be they Jews or Christians, to host Muslims during times of conflict. It is a collective obligation as opposed to an individual one. The community as a whole must ensure that their Muslim allies who travel through the region are kept safe. However, to avoid abuse, the covenants of the Prophet place a reasonable limit on such obligations, 3 days and 3 nights. The Constitution of Medina and the covenants of the Prophet also insist upon the security of persons and their property. Although the legal system was just in its infancy, it did provide for swift trials, public trials overseen by impartial judges. In some instances, cases were in the hands of a single judge. In others, committees or juries were convened. The covenants of the Prophet are adamant that Muslims must act as advocates in the defense of their Christian allies and ensure that they are treated fairly. There was no bail per se in early Islamic society. Dangerous people who might flee were imprisoned, while individuals accused of lesser crimes were allowed to go free on their own recognizance. Finally, the documents do not limit rights to those enumerated. Like the United States, the Muslim Ummah was actually a confederation of believers which delegated powers to autonomous communities and allies. So why is it that the Western tradition appears to have developed independently from the Islamic tradition? It did not. The luminaries who developed Western notions of rights and freedoms did not operate in a vacuum. They were not oblivious to the Islamic tradition. On the contrary, they were inspired by it. Napoleon himself signed a copy of the Covenant of the Prophet Muhammad with the monks of Mount Sinai. The Ashkenaz, along with works on Islamic law, inspired him to compose the Napoleonic Code. This is the legal code in Quebec, Canada, from where I proudly come. I guess we are living under Sharia law after all. I much prefer it to the barbarity that prevailed in Europe and Arabia prior to more enlightened thinking. The covenants of the Prophet were well known to European intellectuals, scholars, diplomats, and monarchs throughout most of history. They cited them, translated them in their entirety, and disseminated them. They inspired scores of treaties between European Christian powers and Middle Eastern and North African Muslim powers. The covenants of the Prophet was included in the Manuel des Consuls, or the Manual of Consuls, by Alexandre Niditz in 1838. This was a classic work on diplomacy, still in print today, which was viewed as mandatory reading for politicians, consuls, diplomats, and ambassadors. The Covenant of the Prophet, in its entirety once again, appeared in Edward Van Dyke's famous work on diplomacy that appeared in 1881. Who was Van Dyke? Only the consular clerk of the United States at Cairo in Egypt. The work was published by the State Department. Western leaders have been studying the Constitution of Medina and the Covenants of the Prophet for centuries. Not only that, they have been consulting the Quran for political inspiration. And how could they not be familiar with the Covenant of the Prophet when the Ottoman Empire itself made a covenant with the United States of America in 1796? The Treaty of Peace and Friendship between the United States of America and the pagan subjects of Tripoli of Barbary. Inspired by the Covenant of the Prophet with the Christians, it reads, "As the government of the United States of America is not in any sense founded on the Christian religion, as it has in itself no character of enmity against the laws, religion, or tranquility of Muslims, and as the said states never entered into any war or act of hostility against any Muslim nation, it is declared by the parties that no pretext arising from religious opinions shall ever produce an interruption of the harmony existing between the two countries." The United States of America signed a covenant of coexistence with the Ottoman Empire. All they had to do was respect it. Had it treated Muslim nations as friends and allies, we would not be in the mess that we are in today. Although all parties have strayed from their respective traditions, Muslim, Christian, and Jewish, over the past couple of centuries, they all stand on the shoulders of Abraham, peace be upon him. We are the religious progeny of the great patriarch. Let us stop the sibling rivalry and obey our honorable father, agreeing that God is one, humanity is one, and justice should be one. We should also recognize that many secular values were inspired in religious values. The Magna Carta, the Declaration of Independence, the Bill of Rights, and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights are all rooted in Jewish, Christian, and Muslim values. Let us rally around them. Thank you.
realize that I was intimidated, being up here, talking about legal documents with two judges.
Well, I'll just say that I first heard about the Constitution of Medina over lunch with Okolo about 6 months ago. So Okolo and I were talking, and we were discussing topics for this program. And we were talking about the United States Constitution, and she mentioned the Constitution of Medina. And I said, I've never heard of the Constitution of Medina. And so she said, well, that needs to be our book, because we need to know about the Constitution of Medina. So that's why I'm here, because of lunch 6 months ago with a polo. But seriously, as lawyers, we are taught about British law. We are taught about, in some respects, French law, especially if you're going to practice in Louisiana and learn the Napoleon Code. But pretty much, that's all we learn in law school. When we graduate, we learn about the laws where we practice. We do learn about the United States Constitution. So I started reading, as a result of our lunch, the Constitution of Medina. And I was amazed to find out, wow, a lot of it sounds like the United States Constitution and the Bill of Rights. So my question to myself was, well, am I the only one that doesn't know that? Someone else out there, some other legal scholars in Mississippi must be around talking about the Constitution of Medina. So I do what I do a lot. I call my fellow judges, and I ask them about legal questions and so forth. So I called one of the federal judges, and I asked if he heard of the Constitution of Medina. He had not. Another federal judge. I asked all my colleagues. I asked lawyers as they came in my courtroom, oh, by the way, have you heard about the Constitution of Medina? Unfortunately, I questioned about 200 lawyers, jurists, and no one had heard of the Constitution of Medina. So, unfortunately, it really doesn't come as a surprise, but what I think we need to do is what you're talking about doing, and that is educate about the Constitution of Medina, because once I read it, and once I mentioned it to several other lawyers and judges, I started getting emails, and they had read about the Constitution of Medina. And if you have, and I have 2 documents that one attorney and one lawyer sent me, because they had got so involved in reading about the Constitution of Medina, they had actually written up something about it. And so I think if we educate lawyers and others about this Constitution, then the question would be, why should they know? We know the Constitution of the United States. Why should we know about any other constitution? Well, one of the things that we know from the Constitution, as was mentioned, is our Bill of Rights, the First Amendment, and we put it first, I hope, because it's the most important. Congress shall make law, no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, and so on and so on. In the Constitution of Medina, the Jews of Bad, and I apologize for my speech, all non-Muslim minorities shall be considered a community with the believers, everybody in Medina. They shall be guaranteed the right of religious freedom with believers. They shall be guaranteed the right of freedom of religion along with the Muslims. The right shall be conferred on their associates as well as themselves. So I don't know about you, but that sounds a lot like what I just read, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. So there, in the Constitution of Medina, we have the protection afforded to everybody in Medina, freedom of religion. And there were several religions. There were the Jews, the Muslims, the pagans, and then there were subsets within, the Jewish religions and so forth. So, it is important to note that that protection that we see in the Bill of Rights is also in the Constitution of Medina. Now, I hate to hear that. I was looking forward to hearing about the next speaker and the Thomas Jefferson's Quran, because in his autobiography, Thomas Jefferson wrote that when he wrote the Bill of Rights and helped to write it, he said, and this is quote, that the Jew, the Gentile, the Christian, the Mohican, the Hindu, the infidel of every denomination should be protected under the law. So I believe the speaker, and I was looking forward to hearing, because Thomas Jefferson had a Quran, those words, whether or not, in her opinion, that was influenced, that the person and the development that was influenced by the Quran. So hopefully she'll just come back and let us know that. In the Constitution, the issue of non-Christian identification was part of the debate, just as in the Constitution of Medina. And so, in Medina, you had to prove loyalty to the state, and you were provided all the protection of the state. And just as our Constitution provides all protections to the citizens of this United States. One of the other interesting parallels was the 14th Amendment. We all know that as equal protection law. In the Constitution of Medina, and it provides a person given constitutional protection, a person given constitutional shelter shall be granted an equal life, liberty, protection as long as he commits no harm and does no act treacherously. Equal protection of the law was a major concept afforded in the Constitution of Medina, just as it is in the United States Constitution. What I think, though, is one of the most interesting parts of the Constitution of Medina is what's not similar in the United States Constitution and the Constitution of Medina. The provision that provides, and this is a constitutional provision, and I know there are debates as to whether the Constitution of Medina is a constitutional charter, a pact, a treaty, but it provides that believers shall not leave anyone destitute among them by not paying his redemption money or blood with in kind. So, no one shall violate the pledge due to his ally, and very much help shall be given to the oppressed. Now, we have a law, and I equate that to the Good Samaritan law. That's a mandate that we help and provide shelter for those who are destitute. There's nothing in the U.S. Constitution that provides that. But it is in discussion. As what do lawyers and what do judges look for to make decisions? We look for what's called precedent. We look for law that's been in existence before, so we can use that law to help us make good legal decisions. Because believe me, as a judge, I always think I heard it all, but something else comes up where there's no law around for me to rely on. So this document, I think we can look at, especially in that particular area. So the document would help us to keep the emphasis on being good neighbors, good citizens, and good people. And then we may be able to see some systematic change that will, what some people will say, provide justice for all.
Dear brothers, dear sisters, Al-Alim. I'm honored to be a part of you. My thanks to Sister Colo for being invited just to be a witness to this marvelous presentation of documentation of Islamic thought and credibility given to Islam. That in itself is worth said. And also, we owe a real debt to Professor Morrow for his documentation, his research on the subject. It's a subject that the judge said has been greatly overlooked. I think there's been much speculation made about the connection between Islam, Prophet Muhammad, and the United States. I think some of you know, maybe not have seen it, but there are two messages that go on in the United States. One is the message that's probably dominated by the media, but then there's another message that is somewhat mentioned in the Khutbah that we just heard about love. But in the Supreme Court of the United States, there are statutes in the halls of the Supreme Court of various leaders of the world, and Prophet Muhammad is there among the other leaders. Most people don't know that. But if Prophet Muhammad were not a significant figure with respect to the laws of this country, you can be assured that there would not be a recognition of Prophet Muhammad in the highest court of the land. So that in itself is a testament to how our government sees, at the highest level, sees Islam and Prophet Muhammad as a peaceful one. I've been told I have 7 minutes, so 7 minutes, there's not a lot that I can really say. Judges previously said some things which probably I was going to say in my remarks, so I won't repeat those, but I'll just try to bring another perspective with respect to that. But I was also thinking of the First Amendment to the United States Constitution. Let there be no compulsion, and that is, let there be no laws establishing religion or the free exercise thereof. There are other parts of the First Amendment, but I'm just going to focus on the religion part because we're Muslims and we're concerned with religion, free exercise of religion for Muslims. In the Quran, and there's a passage, and I would encourage you to look it up because I'm just giving you a portion of the context is what really is so instructive. And the passage in the Quran is that the Quran let there be no compulsion in Now, in the works that Professor Morrow has done, there is much scholarship, but many of us can access on, if we just do a Google search for the Charter of Privileges to the monks of St. Catherine Monastery. And you can just do a Google search on that. But it's a short treaty or letter that was written by Prophet Muhammad in the year of 628 of the calendar. But this is what it says. This is a message from Muhammad ibn Abdullah as a covenant to those who adopt Christianity. Near and far, we are with you. Verily, I, the servants and the helpers and my followers, defend them, the Christians, because Christians are my citizens, and by Allah, I hold out against them anything that displeases them. No compulsion is to be on them. Those are the specific words in the treaty of Prophet Muhammad, prayers and peace be upon him, to these monks of St. Catherine. And so, one of the important aspects of the First Amendment and this discussion about there can be no law establishing the religion or the free exercise thereof is this concept of conscience. And if you do some look at the legislative history or some research around the history of the discussion of the First Amendment and the Bill of Rights, there was a lot of discussion about this concept of conscience. And the notes that I've been able to find, and I think you would find the same if you did the research yourself, is, as was mentioned by Sister Piccolo, is that many of the founders of this Constitution were deists. They were not Christians. Thomas Jefferson, in fact, who is known to have drafted the Declaration of Independence, and these words are really remarkable. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. That's also been presented here by Professor Morrow, and endowed by the Creator. Now, there are many in America who would say that this is a Christian nation, but the founders, in drafting the First Amendment, and Jefferson in the Declaration of Independence didn't refer to Jesus. He referred to Creator, which is a universal concept. As we know, Jefferson spent many years in France, and we know that Europe was largely influenced by the Muslims in Spain and the Renaissance. And so we can more or less understand that he was familiar with the concept of Islam and its influence on the Renaissance which occurred in Europe because of the Muslims and the educational level that they brought to Spain. So it's not at all surprising that when you look at these founding documents, there's no discussion about Jesus. There's a discussion about Creator, and there's a discussion about conscience. Also, one other remark that I would make with respect to our connection with Islam is that when you look at the life example of the Sunnah of Prophet Muhammad, praise and peace be upon him, you see that there was always no respect for Christians. We know from the first migration, we know about the migration of the Hijra from Mecca to Medina, but the first migration was to Abyssinia because Prophet Muhammad, praise and peace be upon him, respected the negus of Abyssinia, even though he was a Christian, but he knew that there were principles that negus relied on that were common to what he was doing in establishing religion in the Arabian Peninsula. And so he knew that his followers who were being persecuted in Mecca would have a safe refuge in that city. So that's just an example of Prophet Muhammad and his understanding of the connection that could exist and did exist with the best principles of Christianity as even practiced in that time, in the 7th century. And that was a safe haven for the early Muslims of Mecca. So I just wanted to thank Professor Morrow for his research. As has happened in Mississippi, I think because of his work, other American lawyers and jurists will study the covenants and the Constitution of Prophet Muhammad and look at the connections that exist and the opportunities for us to elevate ourselves in our understanding of Islam and the foundations of the United States of America. Thank you all.
A wonderful presentation. This is actually very rich because it actually brings all of the stereotypes about Muslims in a proper context. You know, before I guess I open the floor to questions, I really will have 2 questions for 2 judges. So, you know, probably many of you probably are aware that many states actually have passed anti-Sharia law, including the state of Mississippi, by the way. So I wanted to actually, I'm wondering, and the basis of this opposition against Sharia law is that basically Muslims in America are not compatible with the Constitution of Medina, with the, you know, with all of the Planned Fathers principles. So with these discoveries about the Constitution of Medina and the compatibility between the Constitution of Medina and the U.S. Constitution and the Bill of Rights, would this be a grounds for appeal or for challenging those laws in the different states?
Well, I'll say this. One of the things you have to recognize is that there has always been a hostility to Islam. And that goes back to the very beginnings of this country. And so there are some people who are interested in learning, but there are some people that are interested in political advantage for any purpose. So no matter how you tend to educate and inform people, there are some people that are going to still be hostile to Islam. There are going to still be some people that are hostile to Judaism. There's still people going to be hostile to immigrants, even though when you, one of the principles that is essential to America is this concept of immigration. On the Statue of Liberty, and there's a beautiful poetry. Give us your time to pour your huddled masses yearning to breathe free. Send them tempest tossed to me. And we know that if it were not for immigration, America would not have achieved what it has achieved in the world. However, the theme of immigration or anti-immigration is dominant, not only in America, but across the world. So there are political waves that come and go. And so information is not the essential tool that is needed with respect to surviving this. I'll end with the comment that was made during the flip-flop. And that is, religion and faith tells us that we have to stay the course. We know what the truth says. We know what Allah has said in the Quran with respect to the truth, with respect to diversity. That if God had wanted to, He would have made us all one people, but He made us nations and tribes so that we would have to know each other. That is really what integration is based upon. So the information that has been produced by Professor Morrow will elevate those who want to know and learn, but the political environment at the present time is not going to open up an opportunity, in my opinion, to fight the anti-Shah.
And, you know, at some point, once the Constitution of Medina is recognized as authority, and that is going to take, it's going to take an effort to educate people about it, and then for it to be established as authority, at least if not binding authority, at least as persuasive authority, which is authority we use when we need to make a legal, rational argument about something. Once that's established, then I think it can be used to fight all of these laws that are a result of the Islamophobia in this country.
It's difficult for us to convince non-Muslims of the validity of the Constitution of Medina when we have failed to do the same thing with our own community. I mean, honestly, how many of you, now you're all leaders, but nonetheless, how many of you were familiar with the Constitution of Medina? Okay, a significant portion. What about the covenants of the Prophet? All right. You know, if you asked your congregations and your communities, you would find that the majority of them are oblivious to the existence of these documents, and there are historical reasons for that. After the passing of the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, we had the rightly guided caliphs who did their very best to follow his example and his model. We cannot say that the Umayyads and the Abbasids and some of the other dynasties that followed adhered to his example. And so in some cases we had despotism and dynasties and so on. So yeah, it's up to us to return to this original model. We have these so-called Islamists all over the world trying to create an Islamic state. And I guarantee you, they're not familiar with the Constitution of Medina, because it tells if they're doing absolutely the opposite. We have work cut out for us.
Well, I hope that this work will begin with the exhibit that's going to be coming up. So this exhibit is actually going to be starting in Jackson, Mississippi for about 6 or 7 months. And it's going to tour around the country. So I'm actually inviting you for different communities. Brother Al-Alim actually is going to help us to bring the exhibit to Chicago. So anybody that actually would like this exhibit when it begins touring in your localities, please start talking to us about this area. It's going to be designed as a traveling exhibit program. And actually, to add to the educational component, we should put those 3 panelists to travel with the exhibits so they can educate the public with it. Any question, Sister Vance?
So I would argue that the Muslim history is replete with examples of where we did have harmonious relationships with people of other religions, including Christians and Jews. I think it was only the exception that it wasn't the case. The Ottomans are a good example of that, where they had something called the Medina system, which allowed for freedom of religion for people that were non-Muslim. So I think it's an exception, but I agree with you about the monarchy and the fact that immigrant work in this community only really became an issue after 9/11. We suddenly discovered that it's a theology of pluralism, and now we're talking about Jews and Christians and Buddhists and Hindus as being our friends and so forth, because it became necessary for us to build those relationships. And with what the judge said, I completely agree with you that the pushback campaign is part of a larger Islamophobic campaign. But I think that if we did education, Bible and the Torah. In grad school, I had the fortune of reading it with Jewish and Christian scholars, and it was amazing to me. Even though I've been doing this work for 15 years before I went to grad school, I had no idea that there was so much overlap in the Torah and the Quran. The book of Exodus, Job, and the way that Noah and Abraham, there are differences, of course, but we have so much more in common. And I think that if Muslims and Jews were to do that together with each other's lives, I think it would be really enriching in terms of our relationships here in the country, and the same thing with the Bible. The Bible is very different, the New Testament that is, but it enriched my understanding of Jesus. It really deepened my faith in Jesus. And I found out that experience saying that every Muslim needs to read the Bible to have a greater appreciation of who Jesus was and how he's perceived by Christians, and Christians would also benefit tremendously from the verses associated with Jesus and Mary. My organization has walked out of that experience doing something with the Jewish community called Hanukkah Seder, where Seder, of course, is ritual practice for the Jews around Passover. And now we do something called Hanukkah Seder, where we do a Seder together. They're reading our texts and our perspective of the Exodus story, which is the most often told story in the Quran. People may not know that. And the Muslims are reading the Hebrew perspective of the Exodus story and looking at the commonalities and the differences and emphasis in how Jesus is presented and how he's presented in our book as well. In addition to the Medina Constitution and what we've been talking about in that.
Let me just say this. 9/11 was kind of a turning point for some, but for those of us associated with the leadership of Imam Muhammad and his tafsir, we were doing interfaith well before 9/11. And in fact, I spoke at Fordham University School of Law because of our relationship with Focolare. I was supposed to speak to a class, but then 9/11 happened, so I ended up speaking to a much larger gathering because of our connection with the Focolare, which is a Catholic, charismatic movement of the Catholic Church. But the other point I would want to make with respect to how do we address where we are, I think that one of the main things that we can do, especially in this climate, is to see our role as ambassadors of the religion, not so much in terms of the text of our faith, but the primary difficulty in America in particular is that people don't know Muslims. And running for office, Sister Edie made the reference of starting with school boards, serving on boards and commissions. Many times, what can help people understand what Islam is about is through their personal interaction with a Muslim, and in particular, Muslim sisters. In many situations, I've been places where, with my wife, where we're doing the interfaith thing, and I can see, the women kind of listen to me, but when my wife starts talking, then they perk up. And so, don't overlook the mere impact that you can have on non-Muslims in America by just showing up in places where they listen to you and learn from you by your conduct and your appearance and what you say. Oh, this is Islam, not ISIS, not the Taliban, not some of these other radical forces. But when you show up and you present your interests about school board issues, zoning issues, election issues, you can do much to change the climate about Islam in America.
We have 3 more questions here, so let me start with Sister Lee.
Thank you all for your comments. I will try to be brief. I would like to ask you to speak to the limits and capabilities of covenants in the face of cognitive dissonance. So we are talking about this gathering being one of academic thought and also activism. And I, even though we didn't have a session on Thomas Jefferson's Quran, I was reading Didi Spellberg's book about it, and she writes about how, at the time, during Thomas Jefferson's contemporaries were in a society that thought of Islam and Muslims as part of the twin-headed Antichrist. There's the Pope and there's the Sultan. And at the same era,
people who have these codes do nothing about it, including the Muslims. Having this stuff means nothing to my children that they drinking lead water. We come here and we sit around and we listen to this. Our kids are not safe. Not just from each other. I'm buying into that narrative. Whoever got the code of Medina, African children weren't safe then. And they still ain't. When it came to European and Rousseau and the rights of man and Thomas Paine, our kids wasn't safe and they still ain't. They not safe under Donald Trump either, and he didn't start. What is it that we have to do as Muslims to keep our children safe? And what is it that we ain't doing? We have to ask ourselves that. We have to answer to Allah for that. Your children ain't no safer than mine. But those who look like me are really in danger. And you know it. And we need to quit dancing around this. That's the reality I'm talking about.
Thank you, Brother, for your passion. Any more advances?
I don't know if there's a definite answer, but we do have laws in place, and it does frustrate me as I hear, because I listen to the radio, and every time a crime happens, somebody says, we need a law, we need to execute people who do that. There is a law against killing people. You have the law. You don't need to pass any more laws. What you need to do is to vote and elect people to enforce the laws that you have. We have elections coming up, and we, people that look like him, look like me, look like us, don't vote. But the law is there. You vote somebody to enforce that law.
And I think become a candidate. I think you need to take that chance. Maybe the school board is a place to start. When you look at the school and prison pipeline, when you look at the expulsions, suspension, special ed schools, not special ed schools, alternative schools. When you look at the number of our African Americans in those schools, it's around 40%. You look at the number of African Americans in the juvenile system, it's about 40%. You look at the number of African Americans in the prison system, it's about 40%. So the place to start would be the school board.
Starting with you laid out the water, so we can think straight.
Wasn't a beautiful panel? Amazing. Except that we have just 100 people here. And if you go on your social media, Twitter and Facebook, probably we have hundreds and thousands of people following us. They are unaware of it. So my request to those who are good on social media, Twitter, as well as Facebook, on YouTube, is that once the next break comes, I know there is no break, Imad and Okolo control anything in the world, but if the break comes, I would say please gather on this table, those who are active on Twitter, start tweeting with hashtag. You get to Black Lives Matter, No Ban, No Wall, or the handle for the museum is handle Muslim Museum. So people around can connect with you, and brother gonna work on getting us live stream. So we'll send out an email to whoever email list you have. What is the place it is live stream, and how you can tweet with whatever Twitter account you have. So those who like to assist us, please gather here in the break so we conspire together to get more people in.
Thank you. So what we're going to do